Hey there, and welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we have another great podcast for you going strong in 2020. It is with Dr. Ricky Law. He is the author of the new book, Transnational Nazism, Ideology and Culture in German-Japanese Relations. This book was released in 2019. It's a fascinating look at sort of how this Nazi virus, as you'll hear in the show, spread. And it goes to Japan. We talk a little bit about the reverse, the German perceptions of Japanese in German. There's a whole lot of interesting things in the conversation, as well as some of those autobiographical personal stories that make Hour of History the podcast you choose to listen to for all your history information. Thanks so much for listening. As always, there's links to the book and more content at hourofhistory.com. On the Hour of History podcast, it's our world, anytime, any place. Enjoy.
You're listening to the Hour of History podcast, Our World.
Anytime, any place.
For show notes, the Hour of History blog, and more, head over to hourofhistory.com. For book recommendations about topics mentioned during the podcast, head over to hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. Without further delay, the Hour of History starts right now.
So welcome to Hour of History, Dr. Ricky Law. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So your new book, Transnational Nazism, it's a pretty cool topic. Just a little quick background on me. You know, I have some experience studying the Holocaust. I was a fellow at the Holocaust Museum, and I always just was hungry for people who brought in this global transnational perspective. Can you talk a little bit about your background and what led you to this book?
Sure. I majored in history and German as an undergrad in California at the University of California in Berkeley. And I studied abroad in Germany, so I was really pretty good with the language and the history. And then after graduation, I just by chance taught English in Japan for a year with the JET program. And when I first went in, I didn't speak any Japanese. I hardly knew anything about the country, but I really fell in love with the country that year. And so I decided that I really wanted to learn a lot about Japan, and that means going to graduate school. But I also didn't want to forget what I have learned about Germany, so I needed to find a topic that would have German and Japanese history together. And when it came to that, there are really not that many topics, and German-Japanese relations in the 1920s and 30s just stood out. So that's the topic I picked.
That's very cool. It's it seems more common that we get people with overlap and say, like a Spanish Portuguese, and then they do Iberian studies or something like that. It's cool to have things so different. Surely that must have been a challenge. If I can ask, why JET program after studying German in college?
Good question. I was so busy doing a double major, history and German, and I was writing a graduation thesis for both majors. So I was writing a long paper, two of them, and I just didn't have time to look into applying for jobs or graduate programs. So then I saw a flyer, one of those mini flyers, posters on the walls in college campuses, and it was the JET program, teaching English in Japan. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. That was my senior year, so I just came back from studying in Germany at the time. I was just dying to go abroad, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then it said, Japanese knowledge not required. So I picked up an application, and the application was very short. It was 3 pages. The first page was name and address, and I thought, okay, I can do that. I do have time for that. And yeah, it's simple as that. It was purely by chance.
Wow. And it was a good experience. I'm just asking because I'm always encouraging people to kind of go abroad, even if it's not exactly what they imagined. And it sounds like you kind of had that, and it worked out.
Yeah, it worked out. Yes.
That's great. Okay, and so now this new book, it's really got a sort of fascinating title, Transnational Nazism, Ideology and Culture in the German-Japanese Relations. Maybe you could break it down for us, just a general overview of the sort of approach and concepts that you wanted to attack in this book.
Sure. So the goal of the book is to describe the cultural and intellectual background of the alliance between Nazi Germany and militarist Japan in the from the mid-1930s to the end of World War II. So we have fairly good history, certainly based on diplomatic archives, about the alliance itself. That is, broadly speaking, from 1936, with the beginning, the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact between Germany and Japan, until the Tripartite Pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan, and then the rest of World War II. So that's a pretty well-known story, that these right-wing countries formed an alliance. But the German-Japanese alliance has always struck me and many other people as a very strange creature. You have a explicitly racist regime in Nazi Germany, and an explicitly anti-foreign and some would even say racist regime in militarist Japan. And yet, if these two countries signing a treaty and then forming an alliance. And what I wanted to do in the book is to move away from the diplomacy, because that's been fairly well written, but explore what the two societies or elements in the two societies were saying about each other. And to do that, I needed to look into what published material tell us in the 1920s and the early 1930s. And my conclusion is that the diplomatic alliance did not come out in a vacuum. There was a rich prehistory of German-Japanese mutual admiration in the decade and a half or so before 1936. And my main argument is that there was something called transnational Nazism that allowed German Nazis to make room in their ideology for non-German people, in this case the Japanese, and for a non-German people, in this case the Japanese, to become supporters of Hitler and Nazism in Germany.
And to do this, I mean, you've kind of laid it out very clearly for us. It's obvious there's two, cases here. You call it the symmetrical approach. How did you sort of set this up for yourself?
I always wanted to do a balanced history of Germany and Japan because of the linguistic challenge mastering these two languages. Most of the works that we have about Germany and Japan in that period of history either focus on one, or they prefer one or the other language. So you would see books that talk a lot of, from the German perspective or from the Japanese perspective, depending on the language preference of the writer. Or you will have a lot of works that are edited volumes. So these are works with 10, 12, 15 contributors, some writing on Germany, some writing on Japan, and that they put the volume together, so they would have two countries, but you have 10, 12, 15 voices all talking about somewhat different things about the two countries. And I always thought that something was missing, and that is to have one investigator look at these two countries in a comparable, balanced manner, to look at similar sources, to look at similar features, and related figures, to tie in German and Japanese historical figures in a narrative that would be consistent. And so that's what the book sets out to do, to look at both countries by one person, so basically a consistent analytical perspective. And that's what my book set out to do.
Yeah, and it's something sort of I guess you could say reassuring as you go through the book. Knowing that I'm going to get a sort of equal treatment on both sides. It's kind of interesting, and like you said, not a lot of people give it this kind of treatment. Not a lot of people are able to. Now, you mentioned before that you're stepping away from the diplomatic history, which there are diplomatic historians who I know would, are, oh no. And then the cultural historians kind of perk up and get excited. For me, that means you're going to look at some very interesting sources. Could you tell us a little bit about the source bases that you used?
Sure. The source bases are basically material generated by civil society actors, especially in the open source realm, that is published material. Because part of my argument is that the first decade and a half of the interwar period gets overlooked when we look at German-Japanese relations, because there was not a lot of diplomacy between Germany and Japan in the 1920s and the first half of the 1930s. That was a time when Germany, the Weimar Republic, was recovering from World War I, hyperinflation, revolution, and really wasn't thinking about forming any kind of close ties with Japan. And Japan, as a victorious power after World War I, was for several years anyway, interested in playing nice, upholding the Versailles Washington system, acting like a responsible power after World War I, and certainly not going to form any kind of close ties with the loser out of World War I, Germany. So there was just not a lot of bilateral diplomacy in that decade and a half, and so there was not a lot of diplomatic documents that came out of that period. And so it might have created an illusion that there was not anything to look at that period because there was not a lot of documents in the official archives. But my argument is that, well, yes, while the governments were not really dealing very closely with each other, the responsibility to deal with each other went to civil society actors. And because of the distance between the two countries, not a lot of people, certainly fewer Germans than Japanese, were able to travel to the other country. And so those few, relatively few who did, became kind of opinion makers or intermediaries between the two countries. So Germans who could afford to go to Japan and Japanese who could go to Germany kind of bore the responsibility to tell their own countrymen how the other place is like. So they would write newspapers, they would give lectures, they would write pamphlets, write travel logs, or even teach the language or form voluntary associations. So that became the source base that I used, the material generated by these cultural intermediaries.
And I think it's kind of interesting, we begin with your background that you too sort of engaged in this experiment in some ways, going to Germany, seeing what you saw, going to Japan, seeing what you saw. I just think that's a neat little thing that you don't always get. So there's the personal touch.
They all say the dissertation is somewhat autobiographical.
Very interesting. And okay, so we have all these accounts, and they're coming, so in a way you are still doing these high level research, because these are the rich folks who can travel, people who have enough money, because one of the things you mentioned early on is the great distance. How were Germany and Japan even connected?
Badly. Only at the after World War I. I looked into some travel guides for going between the two countries, and it's just stunning how long it took to, at least in the first few years after World War I, to go from one country to the other. So there were basically two options. One is, let's say you go from Germany to Japan. Let's say you go from Germany to Japan. So you have basically the Eurasian option, which is to take a boat, probably from Hamburg or Bremen, and you go through the Mediterranean, then the Indian Ocean, and then the East and South China Seas. to Japan, that would take 2 months because it stopped everywhere along the way. Or you take the western route, so you go from Germany, you cross the Atlantic, then you land in the east coast of North America. You can either take a train through Canada or the United States, and then you get on another boat when you get to the Pacific coast, then cross the Pacific to go to Japan. That totally would take about a month. It's actually faster that way because there are few stops, right? Like you don't stop anywhere in the Atlantic or the Pacific. So that's just straight sailing. And then the trains would take you pretty fast across the continents. So yeah, so just going to the other place would take at least a month. And then you come back. So that's a couple of months off work just to go there. And of course, once you get to the other country, you're not going to stay just for a few days after having spent months at sea. So yeah, and that got so the transportation option got a little bit better in 1927 when the Soviet Union reopened the Trans-Siberian Railway. And once that opened, it was cheaper than the steamships, and that took about close to 2 weeks to go from one country to the other. And that enabled a small measure of mass tourism from Japan to go to Europe to sightsee. And the most remarkable case was in 1929 when the Graf Zeppelin, that's the airship, flew around the world from Germany all the way to Japan, then to the US, then back to Germany. And that reduced the travel time to about 4 days or so from Germany to Japan. Of course, that's a one-time thing. It's not like something that people could book for regular traveling. So the traveling improved significantly, actually, during the interwar period. And so did communication. At the beginning, communication after World War I was basically surface mail. So that's a physical object that traveled only as fast as the steamships or trains could travel. But in the late 1920s, early 1930s, it was possible to broadcast radio signals from one country to the other. So then we saw these so-called friendship radio hours, where listeners in Japan or Germany could actually hear music broadcast from the other country. And these two countries then used that technology in some ways to promote the ideology. Technology and ideology really went hand in hand. So then there were experiments of so-called wireless telephones between Berlin and Tokyo. So these are still radio signals, basically, but they're picked up by telephone. So the communication minister in Germany could speak to his counterpart in Japan. And then after the Nazis took over, we began to hear Hitler's speeches broadcast live in Japan, including the eulogy that Hitler gave at Hindenburg's funeral. That was relayed live from Germany to Japan. Yeah, it's truly remarkable. And one big argument I make is that technology and ideology went hand in hand between Germany and Japan in the 1930s.
Wow. And so you kind of did a great job there, sort of painting the transitions for us. You're looking at the interwar periods, which is interesting because there's so much transition happening. And you kind of pinpoint it throughout. At one point, you have the acquaintance, then the advocacy, then the activism. How did that sort of happen? What was appealing to Japanese about Nazism?
That's a very good question. So look at it, when looked at superficially, this overtly racist ideology should not appeal to the Japanese at all. But what I found, especially in the chapter on the newspapers and the pamphlets, was that Nazism, the ideology, was translated and then transmitted to Japan in a very literal and some might even say superficial way. So especially in the chapters on the pamphlets and lectures, basically there were two types of opinion makers. So there were the pamphleteers writing these very flimsy, pulpy, cheap pamphlets that would, they would only make money by selling masses and masses of the pamphlets. And then there were speakers that would go on lecture circuits and give lectures to pretty exclusive audience. So these are private social clubs or sort of clubs for scholars and politicians that would charge a pretty high membership fee. So there were at least those two channels for bringing Nazism to Japan. And what I found was that when Nazism, the ideology, was translated literally, it actually loses a lot of the cultural context that would make it make sense in Germany. So the big example is the so-called 25-point program of the Nazi Party. This was adopted back in 1920. And there were 25, there were a number of points, and these were pretty sort of populist economic platforms of the so-called German Workers' Party back then, not even the National Socialist German Workers' Party. So these included elements like fair sacrifice and fair benefits for everybody, targeting the big banks, targeting department stores and benefiting smaller shops, making higher education affordable, eliminating interest slavery or debt slavery. Now, only two of these 25 points actually mention Jews specifically. For anyone in Germany at the time reading between the lines, they would know that talking about department stores, talking about big banks, that's kind of a coded language for talking about the Jews. But when that kind of points were translated into Japanese, it kind of eliminated most of that anti-Semitic element. And judging that 25-point program, there was actually relatively little racist elements. And for a lot of the lower and lower middle class Japanese encountering that program in the 1930s, it was actually quite attractive. So that lower stratum of the society found that part of Nazism appealing, the populist economic message. The more exclusive audiences in the lectures didn't like that populism at all, but they latched on to the anti-communism of the Nazis. So they basically said, well, we're not really a big fan of sharing benefits equally, but the Nazis are very aggressively anti-communist, and that's something we can get behind. So the same process that worked in Germany, that is Nazism trying and somewhat succeeding in being everything to everybody, actually had a similar reception in Japan, where people of different economic stations found different elements of Nazism and Hitler likable.
And this concept of Hitler, in Germany, it seems more obvious than it might in translation to Japan. What was Hitler translated as? How was he understood or seen?
So for the first several years of his political career, he didn't make any news in Japan at all. So he briefly made news in 1923 with the unsuccessful beer hall putsch. And back then, there was a lot of confusion about who this Hitler person was. There was even confusion about how to pronounce his name, actually. There were 3 or 4 different ways to transliterate Hitler's name into Japanese. So it was how bad that confusion was. They couldn't even agree on the pronunciation of his name. And then because the Japanese newspapers were very focused on monarchist restoration, they misinterpreted basically any and all right-wing groups as basically monarchists. And indeed, they thought the beer hall putsch was all about restoring the monarchy, which it wasn't. And then Hitler went away in the Japanese media. So you don't hear about him until 1930, when in that year, the election catapulted the Nazi Party to the second largest party in Germany. That's when a lot of Japanese newspapers and pamphleteers and lecturers and book writers returned to paying attention to Hitler. And in some ways, they really bought into the Nazi propaganda machine and the image created by that propaganda machine. Because you got to remember that Germany was a faraway country. Doing research on the ground about Germany was expensive. So they were relying on a lot of material generated from Germany about Hitler in Japan. So basically, who was talking about Hitler in the most? It was the Nazi propaganda machine. So basically, we see a lot of translated Nazi propaganda literature. So these are basically speeches that were published and then just straight up translated into these Hitler biographies in Japan, or they would translate excerpts of Mein Kampf and use that as filler in material talking about Hitler. So basically, it was not a lot of critical thinking or analytical work done about the image of Hitler, but oftentimes it was just straight up importing Nazi propaganda, translated it into Japanese, dressed it up a little bit, and then publishing it.
And throughout your comments from the very beginning, we really see how important this act of translating is. I mean, it is kind of a game of telephone. In a way, did you look at who these translators were? Did you find the same people translating? It was always the German propaganda office, or were there enthusiasts on the ground in Japan?
Yeah, these were done by. This was done voluntarily by Japanese opinion makers, intellectuals. So the government, the two governments were not really involved in translating propaganda material from Germany. Now, let me just say that there was a lot of translation done by the Japanese government of publications from Germany. So legislations, laws, regulations for all kinds of things, from horse racing to lighting lamps on ships. So yeah, it's everything from the Versailles Treaty all the way down to how to run a school for visually impaired children. So there's a broad range of importing material. But the early translation of sort of the Hitler biographies or the Hitler material, that was done by civil society actors. So these are people who had learned German, probably for some other purpose, and became so enthusiastic about Nazism, Hitler, that they undertook the task of translating, say, the 25 program or Hitler speeches on their own to tell the rest of the Japanese people about this thing that they had become very excited. So, yeah, this is actually a voluntary phenomenon in Japan.
Yeah, it's kind of extraordinary. And I mean, it's what you highlight throughout the book, that there is this undercurrent of civil society kind of moving these alliances and this relationship in its own way. And one thing that might help us shift over to Germany a little bit is this sort of looming question in the background of China. And for people who have studied Japanese history or imperial history, know that Japan is active in Manchuria, Korea, throughout the early 20th century. And this is something that Germans would have been aware of, is it not? Was the German understanding of Japan as this sort of like aggressive power in the East, or was it different?
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely the case, that Japan, a lot of German observers of East Asia thought Japan was the leading power in Asia. It was the only great power out of Asia. In fact, that was kind of a set phrase, great power Japan. Germany had an interesting strategy in East Asia in the 1920s, because Germany was so weakened after World War I and didn't have any meaningful presence in East Asia. It actually cultivated China as a working partner, because China was also very frustrated with the post-war settlement. So you have two parties, Germany and Japan, that were not happy with the Versailles Treaty. And so they collaborated economically, and also eventually German military advisors found work in China. And so when Japan took over, conquered Manchuria, the German response was very divided, as it turned out. So there were left-wing Germans, so the socialists and the communists, immediately reached the conclusion that this is imperialism. This is Japanese imperialism, maybe even Japanese fascism at work here. And so it was left-wing Germans supporting China and even actually hosting demonstrations. So there were demonstrations in Berlin managed by the communist and the socialist parties to oppose Japanese imperialism. This is how much they care, right? Like this is a war half a world away in Manchuria. And yet, because of the ideology, worldview of left-wing Germans, they saw it as kind of an ideological struggle that left-wing Germans should come out and support the Chinese in the streets of Berlin. But the right-wing Germans were far more nuanced in their understanding, I guess that's one way to look at it, is that they didn't really see a good guy or bad guy in that war. They only see it as the strong conquering the weak. Kind of a Darwinist way of looking at international affairs. Say, well, the Japanese are strong, therefore it's natural that it prey on the weak. In this case, the Chinese. And so the coverage of the Manchurian crisis in the right-wing press was far less moral. So it's less moralistic. It's just, well, it's Japanese taking over living space. I mean, that was actually a phrase used, that the Japanese empire, overcrowded great power, needed to conquer living space for its people. Yeah, and so the language used is basically, if you look at the Manchurian crisis in the left-wing and the right-wing coverage in Germany, it's like as if they were talking about two different wars. One side talking about a moral struggle, the imperialists are taking over, and the League of Nations helping the imperialists, at least from the left-wing German perspective. But if you look at the right-wing press, it was just, oh yeah, this is just how the world works. This is a strong power doing what strong power should do.
But there were Germans abroad too, like missionaries and such. It's kind of interesting too. We have a sort of a very different religious perspective. A lot of times when you compare countries, you might be able to draw links through religion at least. Was there a gap there?
Strictly speaking, yes. So there were missionaries, German missionaries in China, and also in Japan, actually. But in China, there were German missionaries. And at the very beginning, if we just look at, say, the coverage of the Manchurian crisis in the Catholic press, at the beginning, they actually condemned the attack, saying, well, this is violation of peace. This shouldn't happen. But then once the Japanese had taken over and apparently launched an anti-communist campaign, then the Catholic newspapers switched side to then promote and at least praise Japanese occupation of Manchuria as a good thing, as a way to stop communism. We've got to remember that Manchuria, at least even a lot of China, borders on the Soviet Union. And the spread of communism into East Asia was something that religious Germans cared about, right? They worried that atheist communism would take over the world, and whoever fought that or stopped that in its track was something that they could align with. So it's a little bit of the enemy, is my friend thinking. And yeah, indeed. So yeah, certain religious Germans did see the conflict under a somewhat different light.
But there was no sort of reverse, because Japan, I guess, would have had sort of national Shinto philosophy that just doesn't work in Germany, right?
Yeah, I didn't really see much of that.
Interesting.
No. At least I didn't pick up any of that in the sources.
Yeah, but one of the fascinating sources that you use for Germany is film, and I mean, I guess Shinto might be through here in the way it's portrayed, but one thing you mentioned is that there's still sort of an Orientalist perspective of Japan. What were the Germans seeing in the cinema of Japan?
Uh, the films were very predictable.
Hmm.
There was this thing that I actually ended up calling the familiar unfamiliar. That is, that there was this narrative trope, and this is basically a list of things that you can kind of play bingo, actually. If you watch these films, you have sort of a kind of a bingo card of, there will be a geisha, samurais going to show up, some element of Buddhism, volcano, earthquake, cherry blossom. The list goes on. It was this comical list of stereotypes and tropes about alien Japan. So that's the unfamiliar part, right? Like that. Oh, Japan is such a strange place with all these monks and geisha and kimono and using chopsticks, that kind of things. But this list of things recurs so often that it cannot have been a strange thing for Germans. That's the familiar part. That's why I call it familiar, unfamiliar, that this alien Japan actually was a very familiar sight to the Germans because they see it so much in film. One thing that we should know is that filmmakers were a relatively new class of opinion makers in the interwar period. So films had a couple decades of history in Germany before 1920, but for them to really become sort of the mass medium that it became, that was really in the 1920s. Of course, it got better with sound from the late 1920s and early 1930s. So, but this new class of opinion makers, the filmmakers, did not have the same background and training as the traditional opinion makers, like journalists, like correspondents, like book writers, academics. These are the people that had long scholarly studies of the other, and so they could write about Japan in a pretty in-depth manner. But the filmmakers were not. These directors, might have chanced upon a plot that they liked, or they thought a particular film about Japan would sell. And so the engagement with Japan in film throughout the interwar period remained fairly superficial, and just you use different elements of this familiar, unfamiliar. So like I said, there will be some elements about geisha, about samurai, about cherry blossom. You can just really play that check a box game and see these elements in the film.
So the Japanese or the German sort of perception maybe of the Japanese would be highly characterized.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So to me, that seems like maybe one of the uneven places of this relationship because you have more, I guess, film representations and things like that. Is that true?
That is true.
Okay.
Yeah. So one thing that I said in the book is that the Japanese characters, the Japanese that appear in the films were rarely individuals with individualities. Instead, they were characters with characteristics. That is, individuals in German films were there to quote unquote be Japanese. So they would have these very formulaic behaviors, right? They would uphold their honors at all costs. They are always very sort of cliquish. They were secretive. It's impossible to understand them. Sphinx-like in their face. It's impossible to know these people. And that's not how German individuals appeared in the Japanese media. Now, I didn't look at Japanese films, portrayals of Germany. To me, from my research, it didn't look like there were a lot of Japanese films that portrayed Germany. If you look at elsewhere in the Japanese media, Germans in the Japanese public were highly individualistic. These people had names. These were Hindenburg, these were Hitler, or even fairly ordinary individuals. They would have their names mentioned in the Japanese media, newspapers. Whereas in the German media, the Japanese were very often just the Japanese.
Mm. Yeah, so there is that inconsistency. One thing that Japan does sort of get exposure to Germany is through technology. Um, there's exchanges of technology, and like you mentioned earlier with the sort of radio, telephone, yeah, these things kind of move things forward. One of the ways this emerges is through voluntary associations, which I find kind of fascinating. The German, creation of these voluntary associations. How did that sort of change perspectives in this Japanese-German relationship?
So that's the last chapter of the book, and I think rightly so. So these are organizations, associations formed by German citizens. These are voluntary, so these are not government mandated. And the main one formed in Berlin in the 1920s was the Japan Institute. The driving force behind it was a scientist, indeed a famous scientist, Fritz Haber, sort of the person who broke the nitrogen bond and so made it possible to have explosives and fertilizer. And also he was sort of the father of chemical warfare, having launched poison gas attack during World War I. And he was a staunchly patriotic German. And after World War I, he kind of looked around the world and said, well, we have antagonized almost everybody. And he looked at Japan and said, well, that's one nation that we did not fight extensively during the war. It's a rising power, it's a great power, and that we should use the reputation of German science to win over this friend. So he went to Japan, actually, and was welcomed there like a hero. And he won over some friends over there. So after he returned to Germany, he launched the Japan Institute to promote scholarly and scientific exchange between the two countries. He was very heartened by the recovery effort that Japan was making after the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. And he actually wrote in kind of a manifesto saying that just Japan was recovering from the earthquake. We Germans too can use science and technology to recover from the catastrophe of World War I.
Interesting. Yeah. Sorry to cut you off there. I'm just thinking. I don't know what the historical value of this film is, but that reminds me of the Miyazaki film, which has both the earthquake and Germany and Japan in it. The Wind Rises.
Yes.
Is that what is your analysis of that as a scholar of these things?
To be honest, I try to take my mind off of that that area. When I watch these things, I just want to enjoy it.
Yeah, no, that's a good skill. I think all us historians could learn. Yeah, well, so we're talking about these things that seem so long gone, and I mean, there are the films, and like you said, the films are in our current day probably say more about the current day than the past, so we should just enjoy them. So what is the sort of relevance of this relationship that we have? It's now almost 100 years ago that you're looking into the past. What does it kind of teach us now?
Yeah, I hope we readers take away two things from transnational Nazism. One is to become more careful in terms of consumption of media. So in the concluding pages of my book, I point out this phenomenon, kind of not a straight up comparison, but certainly pointing out the parallels between the interwar era and the current age we're living in. So I say that in the 1920s and from the 1990s, the world was emerging from a global conflict, whether it was World War I or the Cold War. And there was this triumphalist view, certainly from a lot of global liberals and capitalist promoters of capitalist liberal democracy, saying, well, after that war, this is the dominant ideology that is going to be more peace, more democracy, more capitalism. And indeed, there was more freedom. People were able to publish, certainly in places like Germany and Japan, they were able to enjoy more freedom of speech, freedom of association. So we saw people forming groups and parties in those countries. But what I learned looking at media in the interwar period was that just because people were consuming more forms of media, so newspapers, radio, film, pamphlets, lectures, books, language textbooks, and voluntary associations, people did not necessarily become more diverse in their views. So it's quite possible, say in Germany, to read 3 to 4 newspapers and basically consume from the same ideological source. So during weekdays, they might read the Nazi Party organ. They might then on the weekends get a pictorial supplement, also from the Nazi Party. If they live in a certain city, they can get like another city version of the paper. And so if you look on the surface, you say, well, this person is a fairly well-read person. You know, he's subscribing to 3 to 4 newspapers, but all 3, 4 newspapers were basically coming out from the same ideological source. And you could go on with, the person may watch films, but these might be Nazi propaganda films or Nazi published books that this person's reading. And he would join a Nazified voluntary association. And I think, that's the lesson that we can learn in our age, where we have all kinds of forms of media, right? We have cable news, we have radio, we have podcasts, we have YouTube, we have influencers, right?
Yeah.
And we just have to be a little bit careful and say, yeah, the more freedom to speak and to associate, that does not automatically translate into more sophisticated consumers of information. The second lesson that I hope readers would take away from Transnational Nazism is the malleability and the endurability of Nazism as an ideology. So I think certainly when I was growing up, learning about Nazism was something that we do in history books. The Nazis came, then in 1945, they were over. It's something that nobody thought could come away, could come back, right? Could return. What I see in transnational Nazism is that this ideology actually is kind of like a virus. This virus has 2 strains. The first strain is the German or the original Nazi strain. That is, the Nazis decide who gets to be incorporated into the Nazi worldview. So during the 1930s and 40s, they decided to make room for the Japanese. Well, that strain is gone. There's no more official Nazis to decide who belongs and who doesn't, okay? But then the other strain, that is non-German people making use, appropriating or transforming the ideology to suit their own purpose. Well, that strain, unfortunately, is alive and well. And this is something that the Japanese, or at least some anyway, were doing in the 1930s and 40s. They and chose elements in Nazism, the ones that they liked, they kept. The ones that they thought were irrelevant, such as the racism, such as the anti-Semitism, they abandoned and promoted it in Japan. And of course, that's something we are seeing in the 21st century too. We see people who really should have no reason to support Nazism, adopting the symbols, adopting the language. And that's something that I hope readers take away from the book and see that history is relevant here.
Yeah, and those are some really powerful messages. I mean, what has the reception been so far? Have people been able to take that in and take that message to heart? Or is that the sort of feedback you've got so far?
Yeah, I think so. I have been able to talk about the book to different audiences, and I think the takeaway message that we all have is that not to underestimate this ideology and not to take comfort or be complacent and think that, oh yeah, it was defeated. Yeah, the original military version of it was defeated. The political military version of it was defeated. But the fundamental idea itself, it's kind of a regenerating force that it could come back when the moment is right. I think comparing it to a virus is really apt, actually.
And yeah, and do you have any sort of antivirus for us? And besides reading your book, which shows
Well,
kind of the pitfalls, what else should students do as historians do as they're reading these kind of things?
well, I would certainly like to think that my book is part of the vaccine. uh, uh, History, understanding and learning history is important. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche to say if you don't, know the past, you're doomed to repeat it. But there's some truth in that. There really is some truth in that. That human world, the world we are in, is you cannot run an experiment, right? You cannot say, oh, here are the variables. We're going to set this time, here are the conditions, and we'll see if this ideology would thrive in this setting or that ideological atmosphere. So we cannot do that. So the next best thing that we have is history, what happened in the past. And if we don't learn the lesson of consuming media more intelligently, if we don't learn the lesson of being aware that some of these ideologies have a very strong endurance and malleability, then yeah, it's certainly something that we will have to relearn, perhaps in very negative ways. So understanding and knowing history is probably the best defense that we have.
That's awesome, and that is why we talk history on the podcast. Unfortunately, we're getting towards the end, but that means we get to hear your suggestion. There's listeners to this podcast, the Hour of History podcast. They come from all over the world. They're in Russia, they're in Egypt, they're in Israel, they're in Mexico. They're all over the place. What would you suggest to this broad group of historians, people that want to follow your message?
Take risk.
Oh.
I wouldn't be where I am if I didn't act on the spur of the moment and take some risk and not think too far ahead. There were 3 moments like that in my life that I'm only thankful that I did what I ended up doing and not think too much. One was switching majors. So I entered college at first as an electrical engineering and computer science major. I went into history. Didn't think about the consequence. I'm happy that I did it. Not that there were bad consequences, but most people would think that as a very risky move. I'm thankful that I did it. The second that I think I did was to study abroad in Germany. Well, funny you mentioned the international audience that you have. I gained a very international worldview. I just saw this flyer. This flyer came in the mail saying, oh, you are learning a foreign language. You're taking a foreign language class. Have you thought about studying abroad? I had not. I saw that flyer and said, oh, that's a good idea. Let's do that. So I spent a year in Germany. And the third was something I mentioned already, was I saw this poster about teaching English in Japan and went ahead and did it. And I think my life became a lot richer. Much more meaningful because of these risks that I took. Could they have ended up badly? I'm sure. Sometimes you take risks and they don't work out. But if you don't take the risk, then you'll never find out. And I think that's something that I hope the readers will do themselves too.
Yeah, and I think those are great suggestions. But for my suggestion, I'm going to kind of make a similar one to that. It is a risk in itself. So in a way, you'll be following both. But it's kind of what I said earlier. I suggest to all students and to all historians and to all people, really, going abroad is a valuable, just enormously valuable. And I too took a risk. I had actually taken Chinese in college, and the exchange program fell through, and my university said, well, just go to Korea. So they sent me to Korea for a year. It turned out to be great, even though I had to learn a different language that I had been studying, totally different, right? Obviously. apparently the university administration wasn't too worried about it, but it ended up being great. Because it was a risk, but going abroad as well, and you take these opportunities. I taught English in China. I was another sort of. I didn't expect myself to be there necessarily, especially where the city I ended up being. But it's just a sort of fantastic thing, and I highly recommend you if you get a chance to go abroad, and like Ricky said, if you're looking for a career change, or if you're at that moment of change, take it, because. I mean, what's the worst? It doesn't go well and you come back. So anyway, yeah.
You should do something with the languages. You should join the Transnational Historians Club.
Yeah, serious. We need more historians, right, who are able to sort of have this perspective. It's always amazing to me to kind of see like these historical conversations that get bogged down on one country or something, and no one's considered the rest. It's great stuff. So head over to hourofhistory.com. Make sure you pick up your copy of Transnational Nazism. There's going to be links to that and more material at the website. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Ricky, before we sign off?
That's it. Thank you for a wonderful conversation. It was thoroughly enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's a great book, and I hope you all check it out on Hour of History. It's our world, anytime, anyplace. So long.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/recs. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.